Welcome back to Inspired Real Events. My name is Claire Bennett. I am 35 years old, and 7 years ago, my older sister stole my future while everyone in my family applauded her for it. The strange thing is, they didn't hide it. They did it right in front of me. At the time, I was too exhausted to fight, too heartbroken to understand what was happening, and too loyal to imagine the people I loved were quietly building a life for themselves using pieces of mine. But that's the thing about truth. It can stay buried for years. Then one afternoon, a single envelope arrives, a single signature appears, a single lie cracks open, and suddenly everyone who laughed at you starts looking for a place to hide. If you've ever been told to sacrifice for family while nobody sacrificed for you, this story might feel familiar. Because mine began with a promise and ended with a courtroom so silent you could hear people breathing. Let me take you back. 7 years earlier. Before the lawyers, before the headlines, before my sister's face turned white in front of 200 people. Back when I still believed family meant protection. Back when I still believed my sister loved me. Her name was Vanessa. She was 3 years older than me, beautiful, confident, and the kind of woman who could walk into a room and somehow make everyone feel like they should be grateful she arrived. People loved Vanessa. Teachers loved her, neighbors loved her. My parents adored her, and even strangers seemed drawn toward her. Meanwhile, I was the quiet daughter, the dependable one, the daughter who stayed late, worked harder, and asked for less. My mother called it maturity. Looking back now, I realize maturity was just the polite word people used when they expected you to carry their weight. I was 28 then, recently divorced, working 2 jobs and trying to save enough money to open a small bakery. Not a chain, not some huge company. Just a bakery. A tiny place with fresh bread in the mornings and warm cinnamon rolls in the afternoons. That dream kept me alive through every double shift, every missed holiday, and every lonely night. I kept picturing it. White brick walls, wooden shelves, fresh coffee, and a small bell above the door. Nothing fancy. Just mine. For 5 years, I saved every spare dollar. While friends traveled, while coworkers upgraded cars, and while people spent money on things they forgot about a month later, I saved. Slowly, painfully, and carefully. And eventually I had enough. Not all of it, but enough for a down payment on a location I'd been watching for almost a year. It was an old corner building downtown with perfect foot traffic, beautiful windows, and reasonable rent. I still remember holding the keys after signing the preliminary agreement. I sat in my car and cried, not sad tears or hurt tears, but the kind that sneak out when you've been carrying something heavy for so long you forget what standing upright feels like. I called my parents first. My father sounded pleased and my mother said she was proud. Then I called Vanessa. She screamed so loudly into the phone I had to pull it away from my ear. "Oh my gosh, Claire," she laughed and cried, telling me she always knew I'd do it. I believed her. That was my first mistake. The second mistake came 3 weeks later when Vanessa showed up at my apartment carrying wine and takeout. We sat on the floor because I still hadn't bought a proper couch. She spent an hour asking questions about suppliers, costs, permits, and my plans. I thought she was interested. I thought she was being supportive. Instead, she was taking notes. I just didn't know it yet. Months passed, construction started, and the bakery slowly came together. Every paycheck disappeared into paint, equipment, permits, inspections, and furniture. I worked from sunrise until nearly midnight most days. Exhaustion became normal, coffee became a food group, my hands constantly smelled like flour, and somehow I was happier than I'd ever been. Then one Tuesday afternoon everything changed. I received a call from the landlord. At first he sounded confused, then uncomfortable, then concerned. He asked why I'd withdrawn from the lease. I laughed and told him I hadn't. The silence that followed still makes my stomach tighten because he informed me that paperwork had already been submitted. Documents with my signature. Official withdrawal forms. Requests to terminate the agreement. Everything looked legitimate, everything looked authentic, and everything looked like me. Except I hadn't signed a thing. My heart started pounding and I drove downtown immediately. The landlord showed me copies and there it was. My name, my signature, my information. Every page looked real. Almost. One tiny detail was wrong. A single letter, a small mistake nobody else would notice. But I noticed because I'd been writing that signature for years. Someone had forged it. The police got involved, lawyers got involved, the building owner got involved, and within 48 hours I discovered something even worse. The property had already been leased to another tenant. A bakery. A bakery owned by Vanessa Bennett, my own sister. I remember sitting in my car outside the building, watching workers unload equipment, watching my dream disappear through the front door, and watching a giant temporary banner being installed above the windows. It read, "The Bennett Baking Company," with Vanessa's smiling face printed underneath. I couldn't breathe, not because of anger, not at first, because confusion hurt more. How, why, what kind of person does that? I called her immediately, and she answered on the second ring. Calm, relaxed, almost cheerful. For a moment I thought there had to be some explanation, some misunderstanding, some mistake. Then she spoke, and every hope I had died. "Claire," she sighed, "you were moving too slowly." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because my brain couldn't process what I was hearing. Too slowly. 5 years, 2 jobs, thousands of hours, everything I owned, and she said I was moving too slowly. Then she delivered the sentence I would remember for the rest of my life. The opportunity was too good to waste on someone who wasn't ready. Someone who wasn't ready. I felt something inside me crack. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like ice breaking beneath snow. I asked if she forged my signature. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said family should support family, then said she'd gladly hire me. Hire me. In my own dream. I hung up. I sat there shaking, and for the first time in my life, I realized something terrifying. The people who hurt you the worst aren't always your enemies. Sometimes they're the people who know exactly where to place the knife, because they're the ones who taught you where your heart is. I wish I could tell you I fought back immediately. I didn't. For weeks I barely functioned. I went to work, came home, and stared at walls. I cried in grocery store parking lots, cried in the shower, and cried while pretending not to cry. And the worst part, my parents took her side. They said she was ambitious, that business was business, and that Vanessa was only trying to help. Help. That word nearly broke me. Because every time they said it, my sister's bakery grew busier, my dream grew farther away, and everyone around me acted like I should be grateful. But hidden inside the lease documents was a mistake. A mistake so small nobody noticed. Not Vanessa, not her lawyers, not my parents, not even the police. At least not yet. And 7 years later, that tiny mistake would destroy everything she built. Because the truth about stolen dreams is this: sometimes they come back with interest. And when mine returned, it brought an entire courtroom with it. People like to imagine betrayal as a single moment, a slam of a door, a screaming match, or a signature on the wrong line. But real betrayal isn't like that. Real betrayal lingers. It follows you home, sits beside you while you eat dinner alone, waits beside your bed, and becomes part of the air. For months after Vanessa took the bakery, I walked around feeling haunted. Not by her, but by the version of me that existed before she did it. The woman who believed loyalty worked both ways. That woman disappeared, and I missed her. Every morning I drove past the building on my way to work. I told myself I should take another route, but I never did. Maybe part of me needed to see it, to witness exactly what had been stolen. The grand opening happened 6 weeks later, and the entire town showed up. The local newspaper covered it, social media exploded with photos, and my mother posted pictures every hour, celebrating how her beautiful daughter's dream was finally becoming reality. Her daughter, not mine. The dream I'd spent 5 years building suddenly belonged to Vanessa in the public memory. And the strangest thing happened. People started congratulating me. I'd run into neighbors, former classmates, and customers from my old jobs. They smile and say they were so happy for my sister, so proud of what our family had accomplished. I would smile back, then sit in my car afterward and cry until my eyes hurt. One afternoon, I stopped at a grocery store after work, exhausted and running on 3 hours of sleep and pure stubbornness. A woman recognized me near the produce section, squeezed my arm warmly, and said, "Oh, honey, your sister is amazing." I smiled automatically. Then she said something that nearly dropped me to my knees. "You must be so proud she took your little idea and made something real out of it." My little idea made something real. I stood there holding a bag of apples while my entire body went cold. The woman meant no harm. She honestly believed she was complimenting both of us. But in that moment, I realized the story had already been rewritten. Vanessa wasn't the thief, she was the success. I wasn't the victim, I was the stepping stone. History had been edited and everyone had accepted the new version. Everyone except me. That night I sat alone in my apartment staring at old notebooks. 5 years of plans, recipes, budgets, supplier contracts, design sketches, and handwritten dreams. Proof. Boxes and boxes of proof. Yet somehow none of it mattered because proof doesn't always win. Stories do. And Vanessa controlled the story. At least for now. 3 months later, something unexpected happened. The detective assigned to the forgery case called me. His name was Robert Hayes, a quiet man with tired eyes and a habit of speaking carefully. I met him at a small diner downtown, the kind of place where coffee somehow tastes better than at expensive restaurants. He arrived carrying a thick folder. For a moment my heart lifted. Maybe they found something. Maybe justice still existed. Maybe he sat down and sighed, and I knew immediately it wasn't good news. The district attorney wasn't pursuing charges. Not enough evidence. Not enough certainty. Too many family complications. Too much room for reasonable doubt. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because if I didn't laugh, I might throw something. Robert watched me quietly, then said something unexpected. Off the record. I nodded. He leaned forward. I think she did it. The words hung between us. Simple, direct, heavy. I can't prove it, he continued, but I think she did. For some reason, those 5 words helped more than any legal victory could have. Someone believed me. Someone saw it. Someone wasn't pretending. I nearly cried right there in the booth. Instead, I took a sip of coffee and asked what happened next. Robert slid a document across the table. Nothing. Nothing. The most painful word in the English language. No arrest, no charges, no justice, nothing. He stood to leave, then paused and tapped one page inside the folder. Keep your paperwork. What paperwork? Everything. He looked at me carefully. Every contract, every email, every receipt. I frowned. Why? His expression changed slightly, the way someone's changes when they're choosing their words carefully. Because people who do things like this rarely stop after one time. Then he walked away. I thought about those words for months. People who do things like this rarely stop. At the time, I didn't understand. Years later, I'd realize Robert Hayes might have been the smartest person in the entire story. Because Vanessa didn't stop. She accelerated. The bakery exploded in popularity. One location became 2, then 3. Local interviews became regional. Regional became television appearances. Everywhere she went, she told the same story about how she'd worked tirelessly to build her business, how she'd overcome obstacles, and how she'd sacrificed everything. Sometimes she'd even cry, real tears, the kind that make audiences adore you. And every time I watched, I felt physically sick. Not because she was successful, but because she was wearing my life like a costume. Meanwhile, I quietly rebuilt mine. Not out of revenge, but out of necessity. Rent still existed. Bills still existed. Life stubbornly continued. I left my second job and accepted a management position at a commercial bakery 40 miles away. The pay was better, the hours were worse, but for the first time in years I wasn't trying to save a dream. I was simply trying to survive, and oddly enough, survival suited me. The pressure disappeared, the desperation faded. I started sleeping again, laughing again, and remembering who I was before everything happened. Then one rainy Thursday evening, 18 months after Vanessa stole the bakery, someone walked into my life carrying a yellow umbrella. His name was Ethan Marshall. I didn't know then that he'd eventually become my husband, or that he'd be standing beside me during the most important courtroom moment of my life. At the time, he was just a customer. A regular. Quiet. Polite. Terrible at flirting. The kind of man who rehearses conversations in advance and still gets nervous. The first time he asked me out, he accidentally knocked over an entire display of croissants. I laughed so hard coffee came out my nose. He turned bright red and I laughed even harder. And for the first time in almost 2 years, happiness arrived without permission. Slowly. Gently. Like sunlight returning after a storm. Ethan didn't try to fix me, didn't ask me to forgive anyone, and didn't tell me everything happens for a reason. Thank goodness. Instead, he listened. When I told him about Vanessa, he listened. When I cried, he listened. When I got angry, he listened. Then one night he said something nobody else had ever said. Your dream wasn't the bakery. I frowned. Of course it was. He shook his head. No, he smiled softly. The bakery was the vehicle. I stared at him. He continued. Your dream was creating something meaningful. I didn't answer because deep down I knew he was right. The building wasn't the dream. The sign wasn't the dream. The dream was building something nobody could take away. And suddenly, I realized I wasn't done building. Not even close. The next morning, I pulled those old notebooks out of storage. Every recipe, every sketch, every supplier list. Everything. I spread them across the kitchen table, then started planning again. Not another bakery. Something bigger. Something smarter. Something entirely my own. And while I worked through old papers, searching for recipes I'd forgotten existed, a folded document slipped from between two folders and landed on the floor. A document I hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. A copy of the original lease agreement. I almost ignored it. Almost. Then my eyes landed on a handwritten amendment attached to the back. A single page, one signature, one date. One detail so strange it immediately caught my attention. I stared, read it again, then a third time. My heartbeat slowly began to rise, because suddenly I understood what Detective Hayes meant. People who do things like this rarely stop. And hidden on that page was proof that Vanessa hadn't just stolen my dream. She had stolen something else too, something much bigger, something worth millions, something that would remain invisible for years until the day it destroyed everything she'd built. I folded the paper carefully, placed it back inside the folder, and for the first time since losing the bakery, I smiled. The paper didn't look important, and that was the frightening part. The most dangerous things in life rarely announce themselves with flashing lights or desperate pleas for attention. Sometimes they sit quietly in an old folder for years, simply waiting. I sat at my kitchen table long after midnight while rain tapped softly against the windows. Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch, one arm hanging over the side, the television glowing silently in the background. And there I was, staring at a single sheet of paper again and again and again. Something felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong, but subtly wrong. The kind of wrong that scratches at the back of your mind until you can't ignore it anymore. The document was an amendment attached to the original lease proposal, a handwritten adjustment added shortly before the property changed hands. Most people would have skipped right over it, and I almost did. But there was one strange sentence. The property owner had granted preliminary access to business plans, operational concepts, proprietary recipes, supplier agreements, branding concepts, and future expansion proposals during negotiation. At first glance, it sounded like ordinary, boring legal language that people instinctively skim. Then I noticed the date. I checked it twice, then 3 times. The amendment had been signed nearly 6 weeks before Vanessa officially leased the property. My stomach tightened, because there was only one way anyone could have seen those materials 6 weeks earlier. They would have needed access to my private files. Files nobody should have possessed except me. I felt my pulse begin to climb slowly and steadily, like a drumbeat. The next morning I called the property owner's office, not because I expected answers, but out of simple curiosity. I just wanted to know who requested access. The receptionist was polite, then hesitant, then apologetic, explaining that records that old weren't immediately available but promising someone would call back. I thanked her and went to work, honestly forgetting about it as life got busy with production deadlines, staff shortages, and the usual chaos. Then 3 days later, my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, and I almost ignored it. A man introduced himself as Martin, who worked for the property management company, and within 30 seconds he had my full attention. After confirming I was Miss Bennett, he told me he'd found the file. My grip tightened around the phone as I asked what it said. There was a pause, the sound of paper shuffling, and then his voice delivered the blow. The records indicate access was granted through a family representative. My heart skipped. I already knew before he said the name. I knew. Vanessa Bennett. The room suddenly felt very warm. I thanked him, hung up, and stared at the wall. I wasn't shocked, not really. The surprise wasn't that Vanessa had accessed my business plans. The surprise was discovering she'd done it officially, on paper, through proper channels, leaving a trail. For years I'd believed she'd simply copied my dream after stealing the location, but this was different. This suggested planning, preparation, and intent, the difference between seizing an opportunity and executing a strategy. Suddenly I remembered a conversation from years earlier, back when construction was still beginning. Vanessa had sat cross-legged on my apartment floor, smiling and asking question after question about my suppliers, recipes, expansion plans, branding ideas, and future locations. At the time, I thought she was excited and supportive. Now I realized she was conducting research, gathering information, and building a blueprint using me as the source. I should have felt angry, but instead I felt deeply tired because every new truth seemed to uncover 3 older lies underneath it. That night, Ethan found me sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers again. He set 2 mugs of tea down, looked at the mess, looked at me, and smiled. "Should I be worried?" he asked. I laughed, a real laugh, the first one all day. "Probably." He sat across from me, patient as always, and I showed him everything. The amendment, the dates, the access records, the supplier lists, every piece. When I finished, he leaned back, thinking, and then asked one simple question. "What do you actually want?" I frowned. "What do you mean, what outcome?" I opened my mouth, closed it, and realized I didn't know. Did I want money? No. Revenge? Not exactly. An apology? Certainly not. Vanessa wasn't capable of giving a real one. What I wanted was harder to define. I wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside my own head. I wanted reality restored. I wanted somebody besides me to know what happened. Ethan listened carefully, then nodded. "That's different." Different. He was right. Most battles are about winning, but mine was. Mine was about being seen and being believed, and those are 2 very different wars. Months passed, then years, and life moved forward the way life always does. Slowly, relentlessly, and without asking permission. Ethan proposed on a windy October afternoon beside a lake, with no grand audience, no photographers, just the 2 of us and a ring that nearly slipped from his nervous fingers. I laughed so hard I cried, then cried so hard I laughed, and somewhere during all that laughing and crying and hugging, I realized something beautiful. Vanessa had stolen a business, but she hadn't stolen my future. She couldn't, because my future wasn't a building. It was moments, people, love, things she never understood how to value. We married the following spring in a small ceremony with close friends, simple food, and happy tears. My parents attended, and Vanessa attended too, of course she did. She arrived 40 minutes late, wearing a dress far too dramatic for someone else's wedding. The entire room noticed, and she loved that. Some people need attention the way plants need sunlight. Vanessa needed entire weather systems. At the reception, she gave a long speech, mostly about herself. People smiled politely, and I caught Ethan hiding laughter behind his water glass. Suddenly, the whole thing became funny, not because it was harmless, but because it was predictable. For the first time in years, Vanessa stopped feeling powerful and simply felt small. Small people often make the biggest noise. Years rolled forward. The bakery chain expanded to 5 locations, then 8, then 12. Magazine covers, interviews, awards, success, lots of success. Enough success that people began referring to Vanessa as a local business icon. Every time I heard it, I felt a tiny sting, then less, then even less, until eventually almost none at all. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers. One day you realize something that used to destroy your entire week only ruins 10 minutes, then 5, then none. That's when you know you're getting free, or at least freer. Then came the phone call. The one that changed everything. I was 35, almost 7 years removed from losing the bakery and 7 years into rebuilding my life and learning how to be happy again. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I remember because Tuesdays were inventory days, and I nearly didn't answer. The number wasn't saved, just an unknown caller, probably spam. Instead, I picked up and heard a voice I hadn't expected to hear again. "Claire!" I froze. The voice was older now, rougher, more tired, but unmistakable. Detective Robert Hayes. The same detective from years earlier, the same man who told me to keep every document. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. "Do you still have those files?" Every nerve in my body came awake instantly. "What files?" I asked. "The bakery files." My heartbeat started rising fast, dangerously fast. "Yes." A pause long enough to make me grip the counter followed. Then Robert said 7 words that would alter the course of every life connected to Vanessa Bennett. "We need to talk in person." I didn't breathe, not really, not until he continued. "There's been a complaint." Complaint. Such a small word, such an ordinary word, but something in his voice told me this wasn't ordinary, not even close. "What kind of complaint?" I asked. Silence. Then, "The kind that involves millions of dollars." Millions. My knees nearly gave out, and the kitchen suddenly felt too bright, too quiet, too small. I looked out the window at the ordinary world continuing outside. Cars driving, birds moving through trees, people living their lives, completely unaware that the ground beneath my family's story had just started to crack. Robert exhaled slowly. "Claire!" His voice sounded different now, careful and measured. the way someone speaks when standing near explosives. I think your sister has a much bigger problem than a stolen bakery. I closed my eyes, and a chill crawled slowly down my spine. Because after 7 years, the truth wasn't just coming back. It was arriving with interest. And this time, it wasn't coming alone. I barely slept the night before meeting Robert. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the same question. What kind of complaint involves millions of dollars? By sunrise, I had already imagined 100 possibilities: tax fraud, investors, lawsuits, stolen contracts, or maybe even nothing at all. Maybe Robert was chasing shadows, but deep down, I knew better. People don't call after 7 years unless something important has happened, and Robert Hayes was not the kind of man who wasted words. The meeting took place in the same diner where we'd sat years earlier, complete with the same booths, the same coffee, and the same smell of bacon and burnt toast hanging in the air. It's funny how life circles back sometimes. I arrived early, but Robert was already there. He looked older, with more gray around his temples and more lines around his eyes, but his expression was exactly the same. The look of a man carrying information he wasn't excited to deliver. He slid a folder across the table. It was thicker than the first one, much thicker. I stared at it but didn't touch it. Robert took a sip of coffee, then sighed. 3 months ago, he said, an investor filed a complaint. I remained silent. The complaint claimed financial misrepresentation. I frowned. What does that mean? It means somebody believes they were lied to before investing money. My stomach tightened. Vanessa. Robert nodded slowly and deliberately, then opened the folder. Page after page appeared. Financial statements, contracts, emails, investor reports, documents everywhere. At first it looked like another language, filled with rows of numbers, legal terminology, and corporate filings, the kind of paperwork most people never read. Then Robert pointed to a section. Do you recognize this? I leaned closer and froze. It was my handwriting, my actual handwriting, not a copy, not a forgery. I knew it immediately because nobody writes the number 7 the way I do, a habit picked up from an old math teacher years ago. The page contained one of my original growth projections, a business forecast I had created before losing the bakery. It was a document that had never been published, never shared publicly, never used, or at least I thought it hadn't. My pulse accelerated. Where did this come from? Robert looked directly at me. An investor presentation. The words landed like a hammer. I blinked. What? It was used during fundraising. I stared at him, sure I'd misunderstood. He continued, multiple investors were shown projected expansion models. He tapped the page. Models created by you. The diner suddenly felt very quiet. I remembered those documents. I remembered building them late at night over months of research, market analysis, supplier projections, and growth strategies. Every page represented hundreds of hours, and somehow they had ended up inside Vanessa's presentations. Used to raise money, attract investors, and build her empire without my knowledge, permission, or name. I sat back slowly as a strange feeling settled over me. Not anger, not yet, but something colder. Recognition. It was like seeing a familiar face in a crowd. For years I'd believed Vanessa stole one thing, the bakery. Now I was beginning to understand she'd stolen much more. She hadn't just stolen a location, she'd stolen an entire blueprint. Robert watched me carefully. There's more. Of course there was. There always was. The folder seemed endless, every answer creating new questions, and every question uncovering another layer. The investor complaint had started small when one investor became suspicious after noticing discrepancies. Revenue numbers that didn't quite align, growth claims that seemed unusually optimistic, and promises that never materialized. At first, nobody paid attention, since successful companies attract complaints all the time and most go nowhere. Then a second investor came forward, then a third, and soon auditors became involved. Auditors, Robert explained, are very different from family members. They don't care who your parents are, what your reputation is, or how many magazine covers you've been on. They care about documents. Only documents. And documents don't have emotions, don't get intimidated, and don't forget. That realization sent a chill through me, because for 7 years I'd been keeping every piece of paper Robert told me to save. Every draft, note, original business projection, and supplier proposal. At the time it felt obsessive. Now it felt dangerously important. Robert closed the folder, then leaned forward. "Claire," his voice lowered. "Do you remember the amendment?" I nodded immediately. He pulled out another copy, freshly printed, highlighted, annotated, and covered in notes. It looked completely different now, like something investigators had been studying for months. He pointed toward a specific section. "Read this line." I did twice, then a third time. Suddenly I saw it, the thing I'd missed, the thing everyone had missed. A tiny clause buried inside legal language. One sentence that changed everything. Access to proprietary business development materials was granted solely for evaluation purposes and remained the intellectual property of the original creator. I read it again, then again, my heart beginning to pound hard. Because now I understood. Vanessa hadn't merely viewed my materials. According to the document, ownership remained with me. Legally. Always. Those ideas, projections, and concepts were still mine. 7 years later. Still mine. I looked up at Robert and neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally I whispered, "She used them anyway." Robert nodded slowly. "Looks that way." 1,000 memories rushed through my head. The investor presentations, the expansion plans, the interviews, the growth strategy, the chain of bakeries, the public success story. How much of it had originated inside those notebooks on my kitchen table? And more importantly, how much money had been built on top of it? I wasn't thinking about revenge or lawsuits. I was thinking about truth, the same thing I'd wanted all along. The truth existing somewhere outside my own head. For 7 years, people treated me like a jealous sister, a bitter ex-dreamer, someone unable to move on. But documents don't care about feelings, they only care about facts. And facts were beginning to speak very loudly. Robert glanced around the diner, then lowered his voice even further. "What I'm about to tell you stays here." I nodded. His eyes locked onto mine. "The auditors believe there may be fraud." The word landed heavily. Fraud, not family drama, not sibling rivalry. A real crime. My mouth went dry. "How bad?" Robert leaned back, and the expression on his face told me everything before he answered. "Bad, very bad. Potentially tens of millions." For a moment I genuinely couldn't process the number. Tens of millions. The little bakery, the dream, the stolen building, all of it had grown into something enormous, something powerful, something investigators were now pulling apart piece by piece. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the diner windows. People continued eating breakfast, laughing, checking phones, and living ordinary lives. And inside that booth, the future shifted. I felt it the same way you feel thunder before hearing it. Something was coming, something large, something unavoidable. Robert gathered the documents, then paused. "One more thing." I looked up. His expression had changed again, not concern, not caution, but something closer to certainty. "The investors aren't the biggest problem anymore." My heartbeat quickened. "What do you mean?" He stared at me for a long moment, then delivered the sentence that would follow me home. "The federal investigators are looking now." Federal. The word echoed inside my head. Because complaints can disappear, civil lawsuits can settle, and families can bury scandals, but federal investigators don't arrive unless the fire is already burning. I drove home in silence. No radio, no phone calls, nothing. Just the sound of tires against wet pavement and one terrifying realization. 7 years earlier, Vanessa stole my dream. Now the very documents she used to build her empire might become the evidence that destroys it. And somewhere deep inside my chest, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a very long time slowly began to return. Hope. Not revenge. Not hatred. Hope. Because for the first time in 7 years, the truth wasn't losing. The truth was catching up. The first sign of panic wasn't a phone call from a lawyer or even from Vanessa herself. It was my mother. For 7 years, she had treated my existence like a holiday reminder. A birthday text, a Christmas card, an occasional social media comment pretending nothing unusual had happened. Then suddenly she called 3 times in one day. I stared at my phone while it buzzed across the kitchen counter. "Mom, Mom, Mom." The screen kept lighting up. Ethan glanced over from the living room and asked if I was going to answer. I looked at the phone, then looked away. "No." The voicemails arrived a few minutes later, then another, then another. The first sounded cheerful, the second concerned, and the third frightened. That progression told me everything. Something had changed, and whatever had changed was happening fast. By Friday, local business blogs began publishing strange stories. Nothing dramatic at first, just little articles filled with questions, rumors, and anonymous sources using words like audit, investigation, financial review, and corporate inquiry. the kind of cautious language businesses use when they're trying not to say disaster. Then the investors started talking publicly. One interview became 2, then 5. The cracks were spreading, and once cracks become visible, people start looking closer. That's human nature. We ignore perfect walls, but the second we spot a fracture, we want to know how deep it goes. 3 days later, Robert called again. His voice sounded tired, exhausted actually. "How much paperwork do you still have?" he asked. I laughed softly. "All of it." There was a pause, then he laughed too for the first time since I'd known him. "Good. That sounds important," I said. "It is," he replied. My stomach tightened as Robert exhaled slowly. "The investigators want to meet." Those words hit differently than I expected. They weren't exciting or satisfying, they were heavy, very heavy. Because this wasn't a story anymore. This wasn't family drama or gossip. This involved real people, real investigators, and real consequences. The truth had become something tangible, something walking around outside my imagination. The meeting happened in a federal office building 2 weeks later. There were plain walls, gray carpet, no dramatic movie scenes or intimidating spotlights, just professionals doing their jobs. 3 investigators, 1 attorney, me, a table, and boxes. So many boxes. Every notebook I'd saved, every draft, every recipe, every growth projection, every supplier proposal. Years of paperwork were stacked neatly beside me. One investigator spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing handwritten notes from 7 years earlier, while another compared dates, emails, timelines, and documents. The room remained quiet, focused, and methodical. Then something happened. One investigator looked up slowly, his expression changing only slightly but enough for me to notice. It was the way a person's face changes when a puzzle piece suddenly fits. He turned a page, then another, and finally asked a question. "Did you ever license any of this material?" I frowned. "No." "Sell it?" "No." "Transfer ownership?" "No." The room became very still. The investigator exchanged a glance with the attorney, not a dramatic one, but a professional glance that I noticed anyway. People always notice more than they think. The attorney wrote something down, the investigator thanked me, and the meeting continued. But I knew something important had just happened. I just didn't know what. Not yet. The answer arrived 3 days later at 9:17 p.m. through my front door in the form of Vanessa. My sister had not visited my house in over 5 years, yet there she was, standing on my porch holding a bottle of wine and smiling. For a brief second, it felt like stepping into a time machine. The same smile, the same posture, the same performance. Except now I could see the machinery underneath. The calculations, the adjustments, the constant evaluation. She wasn't smiling because she was happy. She was smiling because she'd decided smiling would be useful. I opened the door halfway, nothing more. Vanessa laughed lightly. "Oh my gosh," she said, spreading her arms dramatically. "Are we really this formal now?" I didn't answer. Her smile flickered for just a second, then returned. "I thought we could talk." 7 years of silence, and suddenly she wanted to talk. Interesting. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. The bottle of wine remained trapped awkwardly in her hands, and neither of us mentioned it. For a few moments she chatted about meaningless things, the weather, the town, business, mutual acquaintances. People often do that when they're afraid. They circle the real conversation like swimmers afraid of cold water. Eventually she stopped, and there it was, the reason she'd come. "You've been talking to investigators." Not a question, a statement. I stared at her. She stared back, waiting, calculating, evaluating, the same way she always had. Finally, I nodded a tiny movement, nothing more. The smile disappeared completely. For the first time in years, I saw the real Vanessa. No audience, no investors, no reporters, just her. And she looked scared, genuinely scared. It startled me because fear looked strange on her, like seeing a lion limp. She took a deep breath and tried a different approach, the emotional approach, the family approach, the one she'd learned from our mother. "Claire," her voice softened. "We both know things got messy." Messy, what a fascinating word. People use it when they want to avoid the truth. A hurricane isn't messy, a betrayal isn't messy, a theft isn't messy. But messy sounds harmless, forgivable, accidental. I remained silent. She continued. "We were young." I almost laughed. 30 wasn't young enough to accidentally build a business empire using someone else's work. But I let her keep talking. The more people talk, the more they reveal. Eventually she arrived at the point, the real point, the destination she'd been driving toward since stepping onto my porch. If investigators ask questions, there it was, finally. If they ask about those documents, maybe you could explain the context. The context. Interesting. Not the truth, the context. I folded my arms. What context? Her eyes shifted slightly, then she smiled again, that practiced smile, the one she wore when things weren't going her way. The family context. I looked at her for several seconds. Then something unexpected happened. I felt sorry for her, not because she was suffering, but because she still thought manipulation worked. She still believed relationships were transactions, levers, tools, negotiations. She had never learned another language, and now she was trying to use old tricks on someone who finally recognized them. I shook my head gently. No, one word. Quiet, simple, no. The effect was immediate. The smile vanished. The performance cracked and the frustration underneath appeared. Hot, sharp, ugly. You owe me. The words exploded out before she could stop them. I actually blinked. Owe her? For a moment I wondered if I'd misheard, but she kept going. Years of resentment spilled out, years of entitlement, years of stories she'd told herself about sacrifices, family, support, and how hard she'd worked. And the longer she spoke, the clearer everything became. Vanessa genuinely believed her own version of events. Not entirely, not completely, but enough. Enough to sleep at night, enough to look in mirrors, enough to justify anything. Eventually she stopped, breathing hard, waiting. I looked at my sister, really looked at her. And for the first time, I didn't see a villain. I saw a person trapped inside a story she could no longer control, a person watching reality catch up slowly and relentlessly the way it always does. Then I said something that ended the conversation. Something simple. Something true. If your business was built honestly, you have nothing to worry about. The color drained from her face, not all at once, but gradually, like water leaving sand. Because we both knew. And in that moment, she understood something. I wasn't going to save her. Not because I hated her, but because the truth wasn't mine to change anymore. The investigators would decide what happened next. The documents would decide. The facts would decide. Not me. Vanessa stood there for several seconds, then turned, walked to her car, and drove away. I watched the taillights disappear into the darkness, thinking that would be the strangest part of the week. I was wrong. The strangest part arrived the next morning at 6:42 a.m. when Robert called. His voice sounded different, more serious than I'd ever heard it, more serious than the first investigation, more serious than the federal inquiry, more serious than anything. I answered immediately. What happened? Silence. Then, they found the acquisition files. My heart skipped. What acquisition files? Robert exhaled, and when he spoke, every hair on my arms stood up. The bakery wasn't the only company involved. I sat down slowly, suddenly unable to remain standing. What are you talking about? Another pause, then the sentence that changed everything. The investigators believe your work may have been used to secure multiple acquisitions across 3 states. My mouth went dry. 3 states, multiple companies, millions of dollars. The little bakery, the stolen dream, the original betrayal, it wasn't the whole story, not even close. It was only the first chapter. And somewhere inside a mountain of documents, investigators had just discovered evidence suggesting that what began as a stolen bakery might actually be the foundation of an empire built on borrowed ideas, hidden ownership claims, and years of carefully disguised fraud. The case wasn't getting smaller. It was getting bigger, much bigger. And for the first time, I realized something that sent a chill straight through me. The courtroom showdown I'd imagined for years might not be about a bakery at all. It might be about an entire empire. There is a moment in every storm when people stop pretending it isn't raining. For years, Vanessa had lived in sunshine, basking in magazine covers, ribbon cuttings, awards, interviews, and photographs with politicians, business leaders, and smiling employees who believed they worked for a success story. Now the clouds had arrived, and for the first time, nobody could ignore them. The news broke quietly, not on national television, but in a regional business publication that ran a story questioning financial disclosures connected to several acquisitions made by Vanessa's company. The article wasn't dramatic. In fact, it was almost boring, which is often the case with the most dangerous stories. There were no accusations or emotional language, just facts, dates, documents, and questions that suddenly had very uncomfortable answers. Within 48 hours, investors started calling publicly for transparency. Within a week, attorneys were involved. Within 2 weeks, reporters were parked outside corporate offices, and somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, my family began to fracture. The first crack appeared in my father. He called me on a Sunday afternoon, and I almost didn't answer, but something told me I should. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something had changed. People sound different when they're carrying regret, softer, heavier, like every sentence weighs more than it used to. Claire. Just hearing my name nearly broke him. There was a long silence, then another, before he finally said it. I didn't know. I stared out the kitchen window as rain drifted across the yard, the world feeling very far away. What didn't you know? His voice cracked, actually cracked for the first time in my life. I didn't know how much she took. I closed my eyes, not because I was emotional, but because I was tired in a place sleep couldn't reach. For years, I'd imagined hearing those words. An admission, a recognition, an acknowledgement. And now that it had arrived, it felt strangely empty, like receiving a package long after you'd stopped needing what was inside. My father continued talking slowly and carefully, the way people speak when they know they're already too late. Federal investigators had begun requesting internal communications, emails, messages, and meeting records. The deeper they looked, the more questions appeared, and with every question, the family's carefully maintained version of history became harder to defend. My mother was furious. Not scared, but furious. According to my father, she spent most days alternating between blaming investigators, investors, lawyers, and reporters. Anyone except Vanessa, and anyone except herself. It was the same pattern, the same dance, the same refusal to face reality. Some people spend so much energy avoiding responsibility that they never notice how exhausted they've become. But my father finally noticed, 7 years late. Then he said something that surprised me. Your mother found the notebooks. I frowned. What notebooks? The ones Vanessa kept. A chill ran through me immediately. My father's breathing became uneven, like he was remembering something unpleasant. She kept copies. Copies. The word landed heavily because I suddenly understood what he meant. Vanessa hadn't simply stolen information. She'd archived it, saved it, and collected it like trophies, proof, or insurance. My stomach tightened. What kind of copies? Silence. Then, everything. The kitchen suddenly felt colder. Every recipe, every forecast, every business model, every projection, everything I'd created before losing the bakery had been saved, stored, and hidden for 7 years. I thanked my father and ended the call, then sat alone for nearly an hour, thinking. Something about those notebooks bothered me deeply, not emotionally but logically. People don't keep evidence unless it serves a purpose, so what purpose had it served? That question followed me all week, until the answer arrived unexpectedly through a retired office manager named Carol. Carol had worked for one of Vanessa's acquired companies for 32 years, long enough to know where the skeletons lived and to recognize unusual behavior. Federal investigators interviewed her, then contacted me. At first, I assumed they wanted background information, but instead, they wanted clarification about a storage unit. A storage unit. Of all the things I expected, that wasn't one of them. Apparently, Carol remembered Vanessa maintaining a private unit outside town that wasn't listed on company records, discussed publicly, or used for inventory. It was private, personal, locked, and according to Carol, Vanessa visited it every single month without fail. The investigators obtained access shortly afterward. 3 days later, Robert called again. His voice sounded almost stunned, not excited or triumphant, just stunned. They found it. My heartbeat quickened. The notebooks? Yes. I stood instantly without realizing it. What notebooks? The answer came slowly, like even Robert was struggling to believe it. All of them. Every notebook, every draft, every projection, every supplier strategy, every growth plan, everything I'd created before losing the bakery had been preserved inside storage boxes for 7 years. 7 years of evidence. 7 years of records. 7 years of truth. My knees nearly gave out, not because I was happy, but because I suddenly understood what investigators had found. Proof. Actual proof. Not memories, accusations, or family stories, but proof. And proof changes everything, especially when it's written in ink. The following month became absolute chaos. Reporters multiplied, investors grew louder, attorneys became more aggressive, and for the first time, Vanessa's public image began showing real, visible cracks. One television interview ended abruptly when a reporter asked about intellectual property disputes. Another appearance was canceled entirely, and a major investor withdrew support, followed by another, and then another. The empire wasn't collapsing yet, but it had stopped growing, and when growth stops, panic begins. The second crack appeared in my mother, not publicly but privately. She arrived at my house without warning, standing on the same driveway, porch, and front door where Vanessa had stood weeks earlier. Only this time it was Mom, and for the first time in my entire life she looked old. Not physically, but spiritually, like someone carrying too many lies for too many years. She sat at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around untouched coffee and her eyes fixed downward. For almost 10 minutes she said nothing, then finally, "You could stop this." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was impossible. Federal investigations, audits, evidence, investors, attorneys, thousands of documents, and somehow she believed I controlled it. I shook my head gently. "No." She looked up, desperate. "Claire, she's your sister." There it was, the family card, the oldest card in the deck, the one they'd played my entire life. Except this time it didn't work, not because I'd become cruel, but because I'd become clear. There's a difference. I looked at my mother quietly and asked a question I'd carried for 7 years. "Why didn't you help me?" The room froze completely. Her face changed the way people's faces change when they accidentally walk into the truth. I continued, "When I lost everything." Silence. "When I begged." More silence. "When I needed family." The silence became unbearable until finally tears appeared, real tears, not performance or strategy. And somehow that made it worse because genuine regret arrives far too late for some things. My mother whispered, "We thought she'd succeed." I stared at her, unable to speak. She continued, barely audible now, "We thought you wouldn't." The honesty hit harder than any lie ever could. There it was, the truth. Small, ugly, simple. They bet on the child they believed would win and left the other one behind. Not out of hatred, but out of calculation. That realization hurt in a way betrayal never had, because betrayal requires intent, while this was something colder. A decision, an assessment, a judgment. My mother cried quietly, and for the first time in years I felt no anger, only deep sadness for everyone, for her, for my father, even for Vanessa. Because the thing about building your life on stolen foundations is that eventually the foundation shifts, and when it does, everything above it moves too. After she left, Ethan found me sitting alone on the porch watching the sunset and thinking. He sat beside me, didn't ask questions, didn't offer advice, and just sat. After a while, he squeezed my hand and said something simple. "Whatever happens next," I looked at him. He smiled softly. "It's not your job to save people from the consequences of their choices." I leaned my head against his shoulder, and for a long time neither of us spoke. The sky slowly darkened, stars appeared, and the world kept turning. Meanwhile, somewhere across town, investigators were reviewing one final box from Vanessa's storage unit. One final box, one final collection of papers, one final secret. A secret nobody expected. Not Vanessa, not my parents, not the attorneys, not even Robert. Because hidden beneath years of records sat a sealed envelope, unopened and forgotten, addressed in Vanessa's handwriting. What investigators discovered inside that envelope would become the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case, the piece that transformed a financial investigation into something much bigger, something criminal, something impossible to explain away. And when Robert called me the next morning, his first words were, "Claire, you need to sit down." Because the envelope contained something neither of us expected, a confession. Not complete, not intentional, but a confession all the same. I was sitting at my kitchen table when Robert called. The coffee in front of me had gone cold. I hadn't touched it in 20 minutes. Something about the way he'd spoken the day before wouldn't leave my mind. "You need to sit down." People don't say things like that unless the ground is about to move. I answered on the second ring. "What's in the envelope?" Robert didn't speak immediately. That scared me more than anything he could have said. Finally, he exhaled. "It wasn't supposed to be a confession." I gripped the edge of the table. What was it supposed to be? A backup plan. The words hung there, heavy, confusing, dangerous. What kind of backup plan? Another pause. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. A letter to herself. For a moment I didn't understand. Then I did. Vanessa had written it years ago, sealed it, stored it, and hidden it like some people keep insurance policies, escape routes, or emergency keys. The investigators believed she'd written it shortly after the third acquisition, back when the company was expanding aggressively, investors were flooding in, and she still thought she could control everything. Apparently the letter wasn't addressed to anyone. Not really. It was addressed to the future, to herself. And buried inside it were truths she never expected anyone else to read. Robert's voice lowered. "Claire!" I could hear papers moving. "They found admissions." My pulse quickened. "What kind of admissions?" "The kind attorneys dream about." I closed my eyes slowly, trying to prepare myself. Nothing prepared me. According to Robert, Vanessa had written the letter during one of the worst periods of stress in her life. The company was growing, investors wanted results, banks wanted guarantees, and employees wanted leadership. For the first time, she had privately admitted how much of the foundation wasn't actually hers. Not publicly, not legally, but privately, to herself. The letter described my bakery, not by name, but clearly enough. She wrote about borrowing ideas, then using existing materials, then eventually taking opportunities before someone else could. The language changed throughout the pages. The justifications got weaker, the explanations got thinner, until finally she stopped pretending. One sentence sat alone in the middle of a page, a sentence investigators highlighted immediately. If Claire had been willing to play the game, none of this would have been necessary. I stared at the wall, unable to speak. Not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed what I'd spent years suspecting. She knew, not eventually, not later, not after success. From the beginning, she knew. Robert continued. The letter got worse, much worse, because Vanessa wasn't just discussing me. She discussed acquisitions, investors, company valuations, internal projections, and hidden arrangements. Arrangements nobody outside a very small circle knew existed. Until now. The investigators had spent months trying to understand how several acquisitions happened so quickly. The numbers never quite fit, the timelines never quite matched, and the paperwork always seemed just clean enough. Now they knew why. Vanessa had been moving assets between companies before acquisitions were finalized, manipulating valuations, inflating projections, and presenting investors with numbers that looked stronger than reality. Not every transaction, not every deal, but enough, far more than enough. The letter described it casually, as if she were explaining grocery shopping, as if she genuinely believed success justified whatever it required. I felt sick. Not because of the money, but because of the mindset. Somewhere along the way, my sister had stopped seeing people. She saw pieces, assets, tools, opportunities, obstacles. Everything became a transaction. Everyone became leverage. And eventually, she convinced herself that winning made everything acceptable. The problem with that philosophy is simple. It works, until it doesn't. 3 days later, federal attorneys filed their first major action. The news exploded. This time it wasn't a regional article, a business rumor, or an anonymous source. It was official. Television stations picked it up, national publications started calling, and reporters began digging through every public record they could find. The story grew larger every hour. Vanessa's company released a statement, then another, then a third. Each one sounded more defensive than the last. Investors began abandoning ship, board members resigned, corporate partners distanced themselves, and for the first time the empire looked mortal. The thing that shocked me most wasn't the public reaction. It was the private reaction. People started talking. Former employees, former executives, former partners, people who'd been silent for years suddenly found their voices. Once one person speaks, others realize they're not alone. That's how truths spread. Not like explosions, like cracks. Small at first, then everywhere. A former executive provided emails. A former consultant provided records. A former accountant provided internal reports. Each revelation led investigators somewhere new, each new discovery exposed something older, and every road seemed to lead back to the same place. The beginning, the foundation, the first theft, my theft. One evening, Ethan found me sitting on the porch watching the sunset. Again, I seemed to be doing a lot of that lately, thinking, remembering, trying to understand how we arrived here. He sat beside me. The old porch creaked softly beneath us. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he asked quietly, "Do you hate her?" The question surprised me. Not because it was unfair, but because I genuinely didn't know. I thought about it, really thought about it. About Vanessa, about childhood, about betrayal, about the years in between. Finally, I shook my head. "No." Ethan looked at me. I stared out across the yard. "I don't hate her." The words felt true, strangely true. I think she spent so many years trying to become successful that she forgot how to be good. The evening wind moved through the trees. Somewhere a dog barked. The world kept turning as if none of this mattered, as if courtrooms and investigations and broken families were tiny things. Maybe they were. Ethan squeezed my hand, and for a moment I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not victory, peace. Because regardless of what happened next, I finally understood something. The outcome wasn't mine to control. The truth existed whether people liked it or not, and truth is patient. It doesn't rush. It doesn't panic. It just waits. Sooner or later, people arrive. The courtroom battle officially began 2 months later. The federal building stood downtown, surrounded by cold stone, tall columns, security checkpoints, television trucks, cameras, reporters, and crowds, everything I'd spent years avoiding. The first hearing wasn't dramatic. No shocking speeches. No surprise witnesses, no emotional confessions. Real courtrooms rarely look like movies. What they do have is evidence. And evidence was becoming a problem for Vanessa. A very large problem. The government attorneys arrived carrying dozens of binders. Dozens. Boxes followed behind them. Additional records, additional files, additional discoveries. The sheer volume alone made people whisper. I watched from the gallery quietly, almost unnoticed. Then the doors opened, and Vanessa walked in. For the first time in months, I saw her face to face. She looked thinner, older, tired. The confidence was still there, but something underneath had changed. The certainty was gone. People can survive accusations. They can survive criticism. They can even survive scandals. What they struggle to survive is evidence. And Vanessa knew exactly how much evidence existed. Her eyes found mine across the room. For a brief moment, neither of us looked away. Years passed between us in that silence. Childhood, the bakery, the betrayal, everything. Then something unexpected happened. She looked away first. The hearing began. Attorneys argued, judges listened, reporters scribbled notes, and the machine of justice started turning. Slowly, methodically, relentlessly. And just when I thought I understood the scope of the case, Robert leaned toward me. His expression was unusually serious. "There's something else." My stomach tightened. "What now?" He hesitated, then handed me a copy of a newly discovered report. I looked down, read the first page, then the second, then the third. And the blood drained from my face. Because buried inside the newest evidence was proof that Vanessa hadn't been acting alone. Not even close. There were other names, other executives, other companies, other people who had helped build the deception. People with influence, people with money, people with power. And suddenly this wasn't just a case about my sister anymore. It was becoming something much larger. A network, a conspiracy, an entire system. And as I stared at the list of names, one name near the bottom made my heart stop. Because it belonged to someone I trusted. Someone close. Someone who had been standing beside me through much of this investigation. Someone I never would have suspected. And if the documents were real, the next betrayal was going to hurt even more than the first one. I stared at the name for so long that the letters stopped looking like letters. They became meaningless shapes because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were reading. There had to be a mistake, a typo, a coincidence, something, anything. But the name remained exactly where it was, clear, documented, undeniable. Patricia Monroe. Pat, my attorney. The woman who had stood beside me for nearly 3 years, helped me rebuild the legal side of my life, and earned my trust. For several seconds I couldn't breathe. The courtroom noises faded into the background as people moved, attorneys spoke, and papers shuffled, but all I could see was that name. Robert noticed immediately, and his expression changed. "Claire," I handed him the page. He read the highlighted section, then closed his eyes slowly. Not because he was surprised, but because he wasn't. That realization hurt almost as much as the document itself. "You knew." My voice was careful, painfully careful. "I found out this morning." The room suddenly felt much smaller. My chest tightened, a strange pressure spreading through my ribs, the kind that arrives when old wounds discover new ways to reopen. "What exactly does this mean?" Robert looked toward the attorneys gathered near the front of the courtroom, then back at me. "It means Pat worked on one of the acquisitions." I blinked once, twice, trying to understand. "Worked on it how?" "As outside counsel." I waited because there had to be more. There was. "A decade ago." The air finally returned to my lungs a little, not enough, but enough. Robert continued, "The acquisition was years before she met you." I leaned back in my chair, my heartbeat slowing slightly, only slightly, because there was still a problem, a big one. "Why didn't she tell me?" The answer arrived before he spoke it, because she didn't know, at least not then. The courtroom session ended shortly afterward. The judge scheduled additional hearings, more evidence reviews, more motions, and more delays. The legal machine continued moving at its own stubborn pace. Outside, reporters swarmed like birds, microphones, cameras, questions, noise. So much noise, I hated every second of it. Pat called me that evening. I answered immediately. No greetings, no small talk, just silence. Then her voice, quiet and steady. "I'm sorry." The apology landed strangely because I could hear something underneath it. Fear. Not fear for herself, but fear for me, for my trust, for the possibility that I'd look at her differently. "I should have told you." I sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. "You didn't know." "No." The word came out instantly, without hesitation. The kind of answer people give when it's true. Pat explained everything. Years earlier, she'd briefly worked on paperwork connected to one of Vanessa's acquisitions. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, at least not then. Large business transactions often involve dozens of attorneys, sometimes hundreds, and most never see the full picture, only their assigned piece. Pat had handled one narrow section, finished her work, moved on, and never thought about it again until investigators uncovered the broader scheme. Suddenly, her old name appeared inside thousands of pages of records. Connected. Not guilty. Connected. A huge difference, but not a comfortable one. I listened quietly, then finally asked the question sitting in the middle of my chest. "Are you involved?" Silence. Then, "No." Simple, direct, certain. No defensiveness, no speech, just truth. I believed her immediately, not because I wanted to, but because lies sound different. Eventually, you learn that. People think deception lives in words. It doesn't. It lives in hesitation, avoidance, and over-explanation. Pat did none of those things. When the call ended, I felt better. Not relieved, just steadier. Unfortunately, the universe wasn't finished testing me. The next betrayal arrived 4 days later, and this one was real. Very real. Federal investigators requested another interview. This wasn't unusual anymore. By now, I'd spent countless hours answering questions, reviewing records, explaining timelines, and clarifying details. But this meeting felt different from the beginning. The atmosphere was heavier, more focused. One investigator placed a folder in front of me, then opened it. Inside sat a collection of emails, dozens of them. I recognized the name immediately, David Mercer, my former operations manager. For 6 years, David had worked beside me. Not above me, not below me, beside me. We'd built things together, solved problems together, and celebrated milestones together. When Ethan and I got married, David attended. When my son was born, David brought gifts. When the investigation started, David publicly supported me, or so I thought. The investigator slid an email across the table. I read it once, then twice, then a third time. Each reading hurt more because there was no misunderstanding, no confusion, no ambiguity. David had been feeding information to Vanessa's organization for years. Years. Internal reports, growth projections, strategic plans, private communications, everything. Not constantly, not dramatically, but just enough. Enough to help, enough to matter, enough to betray. The realization hit me harder than anything Vanessa had done. Because enemies are expected. Betrayal from enemies hurts, but betrayal from friends confuses. It scrambles something inside you, makes you question your judgment, your instincts, your memories. I left the meeting numb. Completely numb. That evening, Ethan found me sitting in the backyard long after sunset. The grass was damp beneath my shoes, the sky dark overhead. I hadn't moved in nearly an hour. He sat beside me without speaking. Again, always that gift, the ability to sit quietly when words aren't enough. Eventually, I handed him the printed emails. He read them carefully, folded them, set them aside, and said something I would remember for the rest of my life. "One dishonest person doesn't mean your trust was wrong." I looked at him, confused and hurting. He continued, "Trusting someone isn't a mistake." The night wind stirred around us. "Breaking that trust is the mistake." Something inside me eased, not healed, eased. A tiny difference, but enough to breathe, enough to continue. The following weeks transformed the case. Investigators expanded their focus. Additional executives were named, additional companies came under scrutiny, and additional financial records surfaced. The network grew larger. Much larger. What once looked like a single act of corporate theft now resembled an entire ecosystem. A machine. Complex, layered, profitable, and built on deception. Every week another piece broke loose. The media couldn't get enough. Stories ran nationally, podcasts covered the case, financial analysts debated the fallout, and business schools discussed it. People who had never heard of my bakery suddenly knew my name. I hated that part. Every second of it. I never wanted attention. I wanted truth. Those are very different things. One morning I arrived at the courthouse and noticed something unusual. Vanessa was alone. No entourage, no advisors, no smiling executives, just Vanessa standing near a window looking out at the city. For a moment she looked less like a CEO and more like a tired older sister. I almost walked past. Almost. Instead, I stopped. She turned, saw me, and neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, years stretched. Then finally she laughed. A tiny laugh, sad, broken, nothing like the old Vanessa. You know what the funny part is? I didn't answer. She looked back out the window. I thought I was protecting all of us. The words hung in the air. I studied her face, searching for manipulation, searching for performance, searching for strategy. I found none, only exhaustion, the kind that reaches the bones. She shook her head slowly. Somewhere along the way I stopped knowing where the line was. For the first time in years I believed her, not as an excuse, as a confession. There is a difference. The courtroom doors opened. People began filing inside. Vanessa turned to leave, then paused. Without looking back, she said one final sentence, a sentence that chilled me more than any evidence, more than any investigation, more than any courtroom battle. They haven't found everything yet. Then she walked away. I stood frozen, my heart pounding, because I knew that tone. I knew it very well. It was the tone people use when they're telling the truth. And if Vanessa was telling the truth, then somewhere inside millions of pages of records, somewhere beneath years of fraud, somewhere beneath every revelation already uncovered, there was still something worse. Something hidden. Something powerful enough that even now, with her empire collapsing around her, it still frightened her. And 3 days later, investigators would discover exactly what she meant. A discovery so explosive that the courtroom battle would stop being about money entirely. It would become about freedom. Because for the first time, criminal charges were about to enter the story. 3 days after Vanessa's warning, the entire case changed. Not gradually, not quietly, but all at once. I was at home folding laundry when Robert called. The moment I answered, I knew. Some calls arrive carrying their own gravity, and this was one of them. Claire. His voice was tight and controlled, but underneath it lived something else. Shock, real shock. The kind professionals try not to show. What happened? For a second, all I heard was breathing. Then, they found the offshore accounts. I stopped moving. A shirt slipped from my hands and landed on the floor. What? The investigators found everything. Everything. The word echoed, dangerous, heavy, final. I sat down slowly. Robert continued, explaining that years earlier, during one of the largest acquisition periods, money had begun moving through a series of shell companies. Nothing unusual on the surface, as large businesses often use complicated structures. That wasn't the problem. The problem was where the money ended up and who controlled it. Millions of dollars had been routed through entities that appeared independent, entities investors never knew existed, ultimately connected to people already under investigation. The deeper investigators dug, the worse it became. What began as questions about ownership had evolved into allegations involving financial fraud, falsified disclosures, and criminal misrepresentation. The scale stunned everyone, even the people conducting the investigation. For several moments I couldn't speak. Not because of the numbers, but because of the years, the sheer number of years. How long does someone have to lie before the lie becomes their reality? How many decisions does it take? How many compromises? How many moments where turning back was possible? I thought about Vanessa standing by that courthouse window. They haven't found everything yet. Apparently she had known. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to be afraid. The criminal referrals happened less than a week later, and suddenly the headlines changed. Before, reporters had used words like inquiry, investigation, and dispute. Now the language shifted to criminal exposure, federal charges, and potential prosecution. Everything became sharper, more dangerous, more real. Investors panicked. Several executives hired separate attorneys. Former business partners started cooperating. The walls were closing in fast. Then came the part nobody expected. Vanessa requested a meeting. Not through reporters, not through attorneys, but through the court. She wanted to testify voluntarily. The announcement hit like lightning. Legal analysts spent days debating it. Some called it reckless, others called it strategic, and most couldn't understand it. Neither could I, not at first. The hearing was scheduled 2 months later. Those months felt endless. Evidence continued piling up. Witnesses continued coming forward. Former executives testified, former employees testified, financial experts testified, and investigators testified. The story grew larger every week, and through all of it, Vanessa remained mostly silent, until the day she took the stand. I will remember that morning for the rest of my life. The courthouse overflowed. Reporters crowded every hallway, camera crews lined the sidewalks, and people filled every available seat. The atmosphere felt different, like everyone sensed something important was about to happen, something irreversible. I sat near the back, Ethan beside me, my hands clasped tightly together, not because I was nervous, but because I was tired, so very tired. Years of this, years of questions, years of waiting. The judge entered. The room stood, then sat. Then the doors opened and Vanessa walked in. For the first time since this began, she wasn't dressed like a CEO. No designer image, no carefully constructed confidence. Just a dark suit, minimal makeup, and her hair pulled back. Simple. Human. She took her seat, raised her hand, swore the oath, and everything became very quiet. The questioning began slowly. Basic facts, background information, timeline details. Nothing dramatic. Then the government attorney asked the question everyone had been waiting for. Did you knowingly use business materials developed by Claire Reynolds without authorization? The room seemed to stop breathing. Vanessa looked down for a long time. A very long time. Then she looked up and said, yes. One word. That's all. No excuses, no qualifications, no evasions. Just yes. You could almost feel the air leave the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, people shifted in their seats, and the attorney continued. Why? Another pause. Longer this time, much longer. Then Vanessa answered, and her answer surprised everyone, including me, because I was afraid. The courtroom went still. Not confused, but still. The kind of stillness that happens when people hear something unexpected and don't yet know what to do with it. The attorney frowned. Afraid of what? Vanessa laughed softly, a sad laugh, the kind people make when they're finally exhausted from carrying something. Being ordinary. No one moved. No one spoke. Vanessa continued. For the next hour she told a story. Not to justify herself, not to defend herself, but to explain herself. And those are different things. She talked about childhood, about expectations, about our parents, about achievement, about competition, about always needing to be the successful one, the impressive one, the chosen one. She talked about fear, deep fear. Fear of failure, fear of disappointment, fear of becoming nobody. Then she described the bakery. My bakery. The first time she saw the plans, the first time she realized how good they were, how complete they were, how much potential existed inside them. And instead of supporting me, she saw opportunity. She saw a shortcut. She saw a ladder, and she climbed it, one rung at a time, one compromise at a time, one justification at a time, until eventually she couldn't remember where the ladder ended and the lie began. Tears appeared several times during her testimony. Not dramatic tears, but real ones, unwanted ones, the kind people keep wiping away because they're annoyed they exist. For hours she answered questions, and with every answer another layer disappeared. The polished executive, the public figure, the success story, all of it stripped away until only a person remained. A deeply flawed person, a person who made devastating choices, but still a person. At one point the attorney asked whether she regretted what she'd done. Vanessa looked across the courtroom directly at me for the first time that day. Our eyes met, and she said quietly, every day. I wish I could tell you it fixed something. It didn't. Truth isn't a magic trick. It doesn't erase damage, restore years, or return stolen opportunities. But it matters, because reality matters. And for the first time in a very long time, reality was finally being spoken aloud. The testimony continued until late afternoon. Then something unexpected happened. The government attorney introduced one final exhibit, a document, just one, a simple document. The courtroom screens displayed it. The title appeared, and suddenly every attorney in the room became alert. Every single one. I could feel it like electricity. The judge leaned forward. The reporters leaned forward. Everyone did, because the document wasn't financial. It wasn't corporate. It wasn't business-related at all. It was personal, very personal. A private agreement signed years earlier. An agreement investigators had only recently discovered. An agreement connecting several key people in the case, including someone nobody expected. Someone whose name had never appeared publicly. Someone powerful. Someone influential. Someone who had spent years operating safely in the shadows while others took the risks. The courtroom exploded into whispers. Attorneys immediately requested recesses. Reporters rushed toward exits. Phones appeared everywhere. The judge struggled to restore order. And sitting in the middle of that chaos, I stared at the screen, unable to believe what I was reading. Because among the signatures on that agreement, beneath Vanessa's, beneath several executives, beneath names investigators already knew, was one final signature. A signature I recognized instantly. A signature that made my blood run cold. Not because it belonged to a stranger, but because it belonged to someone much closer. Someone whose involvement would devastate my family. Someone whose betrayal stretched back even further than Vanessa's. Someone who had helped create the very conditions that started all of this. My father. And in that moment, I realized the final courtroom battle was never going to be about my sister alone. The deepest secret in the entire case had been sitting inside my own family all along. For a long moment, I couldn't hear anything. Not the reporters, not the attorneys, not the judge. Nothing. The courtroom became a blur of moving mouths and shifting papers because all I could see was my father's signature. His name, written clearly across the bottom of a document he had spent years pretending didn't exist. Gary Reynolds. My father. The man who always looked at his shoes, who always claimed things were complicated, who never chose a side. Suddenly, I understood something. He had chosen a side a very long time ago. He just never wanted anyone to notice. The hearing was suspended for the day, and reporters practically ran from the building. Phones lit up everywhere, and news alerts exploded across the country. Commentators who had spent months discussing corporate fraud suddenly had a new angle, a family angle, the kind the media loves. I hated it because despite everything that had happened, part of me still wanted one thing. Not money, not revenge, not headlines. I wanted one adult in my childhood to have done the right thing, just one. That night I sat alone on my porch, the same porch where Ethan eventually found me. The stars were beginning to appear and the air smelled like summer grass. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Then he sat beside me quietly, the way he always did. Finally I asked the question I'd been carrying all evening. Why is this the part that hurts most? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He thought about it, really thought, then he said, "Because your sister betrayed your business." I looked over. He continued softly, "Your father betrayed your trust." The words landed gently, but they landed hard because they were true. The next morning, investigators released additional details. The agreement had been signed nearly 12 years earlier, long before the acquisitions, long before the empire, long before the public success. Back when everything was still small enough to stop. The agreement revealed something nobody expected. My father had quietly provided seed capital. Not much, just enough to help launch the first expansion, enough to gain access, enough to become financially connected. At first glance it looked innocent. Family helping family, nothing unusual. But the deeper investigators dug, the more troubling the picture became. Emails surfaced, meeting notes surfaced, financial discussions surfaced, and buried inside those records was a truth that shattered the final illusion. My father knew. Not every detail, not every transaction, but enough. Far more than enough. He knew Vanessa was using materials that weren't hers. He knew ownership questions existed. He knew concerns had been raised, and he chose silence over and over again for years. The reason hurt more than the silence itself because it wasn't greed. Not entirely. It was fear. The same fear that had ruled him his entire life. Fear of conflict, fear of disappointing people, fear of standing up and saying no, fear of choosing what was right if it meant paying a price. The same fear that kept him on a porch, while his daughter drove away crying. The same fear that kept him looking at the ground. The same fear that followed him into every important decision of his life. Eventually, the courtroom proceedings resumed. This time the atmosphere felt different, heavier, final. Everyone knew the ending was approaching. Weeks of testimony followed, bringing more evidence, more witnesses, more records. But honestly, the outcome stopped being the important part because by then the truth was already visible. Everybody could see it. The courtroom was simply catching up. Then came my father's testimony. I wasn't prepared for it. I thought I was. I wasn't. He walked to the witness stand looking 20 years older than he had a year earlier. His shoulders sagged and his face seemed smaller somehow, as though years of hiding had finally become too heavy to carry. The questions began, simple ones, then harder ones, then impossible ones. Eventually, the attorney asked him directly, "Did you know Claire's work was being used without her permission?" The courtroom became silent. My father stared straight ahead. Seconds passed, then more. Finally, he whispered, Yes. I closed my eyes, not because I was surprised, but because hearing it out loud made it real. The attorney continued, "Why didn't you say anything?" My father looked down. Of course he did. Then something happened that I will never forget. For the first time in my life, he looked back up, directly. Not at the floor, not at the table, not at an attorney. At me. His eyes filled with tears, real tears, and he answered, "I told myself I was protecting my family." His voice broke completely. But I was really protecting myself. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the reporters seemed to pause because everybody understands that kind of truth. Everybody has met it somewhere, in a parent, a friend, a spouse, a mirror. The attorney asked one final question. "If you could go back, what would you do differently?" My father cried openly then. No performance, no strategy, no defense, just grief. The grief of a man arriving years late to his own life. And he said, "I would have opened the door." The courtroom remained silent for several seconds. Then the testimony ended. A week later, the legal resolutions arrived. Some criminal, some civil, some financial, some professional. The exact details filled hundreds of pages, but the headlines were simple. The empire collapsed. Assets were sold. Companies were dissolved. Executives faced consequences. Investors recovered what they could. Years of deception finally reached their end. Vanessa accepted responsibility publicly and completely, not because it saved her. It didn't. But because there was finally nowhere left to hide. My father lost almost everything he'd spent years trying to protect. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all him. My mother spent months blaming everyone, investigators, lawyers, the media, the courts, reality itself, until eventually even she ran out of people to blame. And then came the strangest part of all, peace. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, the way sunrise happens, so slowly you almost miss it. Months later, I received a letter. Handwritten, simple, no legal language, no explanations, no excuses. Just one page from my father, the last letter he ever sent me. Inside it, he wrote, "I spent my life believing that avoiding hard choices made me kind. It didn't. It made me absent. You deserved a father who opened the door. I am sorry I wasn't him." I cried when I read it, not because it fixed anything. It didn't, but because it was the truth. And truth matters, even late, especially late. I never wrote back, not out of anger, but because there simply wasn't anything left to say. Some stories end with reconciliation. This one didn't. It ended with understanding, which is not the same thing. And sometimes it's enough. 3 years later, the bakery exists again. Not the original, but something smaller, quieter, something entirely mine. The front window faces a little park where children run past every afternoon. Regular customers know my name, and the cinnamon rolls sell out every Saturday. I still laugh about that. After everything that happened, after investigations, courtrooms, headlines, millions of dollars, the thing that brings me the most joy is watching someone smile over a pastry and a cup of coffee. Funny how life works. Ethan manages the books, our son helps after school, and the staff feels like family. Real family. The kind that shows up, the kind that stays. One autumn morning, a young woman came into the bakery carrying a business plan. She looked nervous, terrified honestly. She asked if I'd look it over, saying nobody believed in her idea, nobody thought it would work, nobody thought she could do it. I smiled because I'd heard those words before. I invited her to sit, bought her coffee, and spent 2 hours going through every page. When she left, she hugged me with tears in her eyes and hope in her voice. After the door closed, I sat quietly for a moment thinking. Because suddenly I understood something. The greatest revenge had never been winning. It had never been the courtroom. It had never been watching an empire fall. The greatest revenge was becoming the person I needed when nobody showed up for me. That was the victory. That was the freedom. That was the ending. If you've made it this far, maybe you've known someone who closed a door when you needed it opened. Maybe you've spent years wondering why. Maybe you've carried that weight longer than you should have. If so, hear this. Their choice was a reflection of them, not your worth. The people who matter don't calculate your value before they help you. They don't ask whether you'll succeed before they care. They don't keep ledgers, and they don't turn love into an investment. The right people simply pull out another chair. And if you're lucky enough to find those people, hold them close, because they are rare, they are precious, and they are worth more than every empire built on borrowed foundations. That's my story. One bakery, one family, one courtroom, and one lesson that took me far too long to learn. The doors that matter most are not the ones that open for you. They're the ones you choose to open for someone else.